The check was sitting on the dining room table when I came downstairs that morning. Not an envelope. Not a folder of legal documents with a polite cover letter explaining the terms. Just a check, face up, written out in my name, with 6 zeros after the 2. My mother-in-law, Patricia Holt, was seated at the head of the table that technically belonged to me, wearing the kind of blazer she saved for occasions she considered business transactions. Her attorney sat beside her, a thin man named Gerald who smelled like expensive cologne and spoke in the careful, measured sentences of someone paid to make things disappear quietly. My husband David was not in the room. That told me everything I needed to know about who was really running this marriage. "Sit down, Sandra," Patricia said, gesturing toward the chair across from her the way you gesture toward a chair in your own office. Not mine, hers, even here in my kitchen. With my coffee still warming on the counter, she managed to make me feel like a visitor. I sat. Gerald opened his briefcase and slid a document across the table. 37 pages, I counted later. 37 pages to dismantle 11 years. "This is straightforward," Patricia said, folding her hands in that composed way she had, the way that always made me feel like I was being assessed and found slightly lacking. "You sign, you take the $2 million, and everyone moves forward cleanly. No drawn-out proceedings, no ugly discoveries, just a clean ending." I looked at the check. I looked at the document. Then I looked at Patricia, and I said the only honest thing I could think of at that moment. "Can I have some coffee first?" She blinked. Gerald's pen hovered uncertainly. I got up, poured myself a cup, and stood at my kitchen counter, for a moment looking out the window at the backyard, where David and I had planted a vegetable garden the first spring we lived here. The tomatoes had never quite worked out. Neither, apparently, had the marriage. What Patricia didn't know, sitting at my table with her checkbook and her attorney and her clean ending, was that 3 weeks earlier, I had received a phone call that changed the nature of this entire conversation. And I hadn't told a single person about it. "My name is Sandra Holt, née Beaumont. I am 43 years old, and I spent 11 years of my life trying to be exactly what David's family wanted me to be, not who I was. What they wanted. I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, the daughter of a high school science teacher and a woman who ran a small alteration shop out of our garage. We weren't poor, but we weren't the kind of family that had attorneys on retainer or mothers who wore blazers to breakfast. David and I met at a conference in Atlanta when I was 31. He was handsome, attentive, the kind of man who remembered what you'd ordered the first time and made sure you had it the second. He was also the son of Edward and Patricia Holt, who had built a regional real estate development company over 40 years into something worth considerably more than I understood at the time. I didn't know what I was marrying into until I was already in it. The Holt family had a way of making you feel welcome. That was really a form of orientation. Every family gathering was an opportunity to learn the rules. Every holiday dinner a quiet exam on whether you'd absorbed them properly. Patricia called it having standards. I called it exhausting. But I loved David, or I loved the version of David that existed when it was just the two of us, away from his family's gravitational pull. He was different then. Lighter, funnier. He'd do impressions of old movies and make elaborate breakfasts on Sunday mornings. And sometimes we'd sit on the back porch until midnight talking about nothing important. And those nights were the best of our marriage. The problem was those nights became rarer every year, and the gravity became stronger. And eventually I couldn't quite remember the last time David had done an impression or made eggs, Benedict, or stayed up past 10 o'clock talking to me about nothing. Patricia had opinions about everything from how I decorated our house to whether I should consider a different career path. Mine was hospital administration, which she found vaguely unglamorous, to why I hadn't yet produced a grandchild, which she raised approximately every 6 months with the persistence of someone who believed repetition was a form of persuasion. I had learned to smile and absorb and redirect. I had also, quietly, over the course of 11 years, become very good at paying attention. That skill was about to matter considerably. The marriage started fracturing about 2 years ago, though, if I'm honest, the hairline cracks had been there longer. David began working later, which I attributed to the company's expansion into a new market. He became distracted at home, which I attributed to stress. He stopped coming to bed at a reasonable hour, which I attributed to insomnia. I attributed a lot of things to the wrong causes for longer than I should have. It was our accountant, a mild-mannered man named Terry who'd handled our personal finances for 6 years, who finally said something that started me paying attention in the right direction. He called me in March of last year, sounding uncomfortable in the way that accountants sound when they've noticed something they wish they hadn't. Sandra, I've been looking at the household accounts, and there are some withdrawals over the past 18 months I wanted to flag for you. I assumed you were aware, but some of these don't match anything in your regular expense pattern. I was not aware. The withdrawals were modest by Holt family standards. Nothing that would trigger alarm bells in an account their size. 400 here, 700 there, 1,000 in a month where David had supposedly been traveling for work. But the pattern was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. I didn't confront David. I'm not impulsive by nature, and I'd learned enough from watching Patricia operate over 11 years to understand that confrontation, without complete information, is just a warning shot. You lose the element of surprise and gain nothing but defensiveness. Instead, I called my college roommate, Denise, who'd become a family law attorney in Nashville and owed me a favor I'd never collected. "Send me everything you have," she said after I explained. "And don't say a word to anyone until we've talked." I didn't. For 3 months, I gathered quietly. Bank statements, credit card records, the cell phone bill that David managed but that I had equal legal access to as an account holder. What I found was not what I expected. I'd expected another woman. That was the obvious answer. The shape the story seemed to be forming itself into. And there was that eventually a woman named Christine who worked at a commercial real estate firm David's company partnered with regularly. But the financial picture was more complicated than an affair. David had been moving money into an account I wasn't on. Not huge amounts, not at first, but consistently, methodically, for nearly 2 years. The account was at a different bank entirely, opened 6 months before the withdrawals from our joint accounts began. Denise looked at the records I sent her and went quiet for a long moment. "Sandra," she said carefully, "I think he was planning to leave before you had any idea he was unhappy." The thought should have devastated me. Instead, it clarified something I'd been circling without being able to name. He hadn't just fallen out of love. He'd made a decision, drawn up plans, and let me continue living inside a marriage I thought was merely struggling while he was quietly building an exit. That was the thing that hardened something in me, not the betrayal. Not Christine. The planning. Denise advised me to do 3 things before anyone in the Holt family became aware that I knew anything. First, get my own financial picture completely clear. Second, document everything thoroughly. Third, understand what I was actually entitled to under Louisiana law, where we had married, and Texas law, where we currently lived, and how those jurisdictions handled the assets I'd accumulated independently versus the ones acquired during the marriage. This third piece was where things became interesting. Before I married David, I had what his family considered a modest savings account and what I considered 11 years of disciplined budgeting from my salary at the hospital, system where I'd worked since graduate school. What neither David nor Patricia had ever asked about, because they'd never considered it relevant, was the stock portfolio. My father had been a science teacher, but he had also been a quietly obsessive investor. Nothing flashy, nothing that would have impressed the Holts. Index funds, dividend stocks, a methodical 30-year accumulation built on the principle that patience and consistency compound over time. When he died 4 years ago, he left me his portfolio, valued at the time at just under $800,000. I'd kept it entirely separate from our marital finances, in my name alone, in an account David knew existed in the vague way spouses know things they've never been curious about. He knew I had some investments from my dad. He did not know the specifics. He also didn't know that over the 4 years since my father's death, following my father's own principles, the portfolio had grown. Significantly, Denise helped me get an accurate current valuation. When the number came back, I sat with it for a full day before I could quite make it feel real. My father's patient, unfashionable, index fund and dividends portfolio, left to his daughter and managed exactly as he'd taught her, was now worth $4.3 million, all premarital or inherited assets. All mine. The phone call came 3 weeks before. Patricia showed up at my breakfast table with a check. It was from a man named Robert Calloway, the kind of attorney whose name I'd seen on the bottom of official Holt family communications over the years. He was calling, he explained, on behalf of Edward and Patricia Holt. "Mrs. Holt, the family has become aware that David intends to file for divorce. They'd like to resolve this matter as efficiently as possible and have authorized me to communicate a settlement offer." He used the phrase settlement offer. The way people use the phrase, "we'd like to wrap this up," when what they mean is they'd like you to stop asking questions. $2 million, he explained, in exchange for a full settlement of all marital claims, a non-disclosure agreement about the terms, and a commitment to an uncontested divorce proceeding. He presented it as generosity. I presented myself as someone who needed time to think. What I was actually doing was calling Denise. They're offering $2 million to make this go away quietly, I told her. There was a pause. Do they know about your investment accounts? I don't think so. Then they think they're buying your silence about something specific, she said slowly. The question is what? The affair is embarrassing but not catastrophic. $2 million is a significant offer for a man with David's assets, unless there's something else they're trying to keep quiet. That sent me back to the records. I hadn't looked closely enough at the business side. My accountant Terry had flagged personal account withdrawals, but I hadn't asked him to look at the company's dealings. I called Terry the next morning. I need you to look at something else, I said. Can you pull anything you have access to on Holt Development's project accounts? He came back to me 4 days later, and this time he didn't sound merely uncomfortable. He sounded alarmed. There was a project, a mixed-use development on the south side of the city, a joint venture between Holt Development and a municipal infrastructure fund. Public money involved, tax incentives, grants, the kind of public-private partnership that gets announced with ribbon-cutting ceremonies and local news coverage, and buried in the project's financial structure, in a layer of pass-through entities that Terry had to map out on a whiteboard to explain to me, were payments to a consulting firm that appeared to have been substantially involved in securing the project's approval, a consulting firm that, when Terry traced the ownership, turned out to be controlled by an entity connected to David's separately established account. Sandra, Terry said very quietly, I'm going to recommend that you talk to a specific type of attorney. Not just a divorce attorney. What type? The kind that handles cases involving potential misuse of public funds. I sat with that for 2 days. Then I made the hardest phone call of the process, to a former colleague who now worked as a compliance officer at the state level. She listened to what I described, asked 3 very precise questions, and then said, Send me the documentation. Don't talk to anyone in that family until I call you back. She called me back in 6 days. What you've described is consistent with a pattern my office has been watching for approximately 8 months, she said. I need to be very careful about what I tell you, but I'll say this much. The offer they made you isn't generosity. It's containment. So when Patricia sat down at my table with her $2 million check in her 37-page document and her phrase, clean ending, I understood the conversation I was actually in. I was not a wife being bought out of a failed marriage. I was a witness being paid to disappear. I took my time with the coffee. Gerald had attempted twice to guide me back to the document. Patricia had remained composed, in the way of someone who has always gotten what she wanted by being the most composed person in the room. Finally, I set down my mug, sat back down at the table, and looked at her with the kind of steadiness I'd been practicing for 11 years in her presence. I appreciate the offer, Patricia. She nodded, satisfied, reaching slightly toward the document. But I need you to understand something before we discuss this any further. Her hand stopped. I've spoken to my own attorney. I kept my voice even, conversational, the way she kept hers. And I've done quite a bit of research over the past several weeks. I want to make sure we're having the right conversation. Gerald's expensive cologne stillness shifted slightly. Of course, Patricia said, her composure intact but recalibrated. What concerns do you have about the terms? Not the terms, exactly. I looked at her directly. More the reasoning. You're offering me $2 million to settle what is, from a purely asset-based standpoint, a fairly straightforward marital estate with no minor children, and a prenuptial agreement that was never actually finalized. Something flickered behind her eyes. We had begun prenuptial discussions 11 years ago. Patricia had wanted one. David had wanted one. I had agreed in principle. Then the process had stalled, in the way things sometimes stall in the middle of a wedding with many moving pieces, and the document had never been signed. I knew this because Denise had looked for it. It didn't exist. Beyond the marital estate, I continued, I have my own assets which are entirely separate from any joint holdings and not relevant to the settlement. And then there's the question of what this settlement is actually intended to address. Gerald set down his pen. That was interesting. Patricia was very still. I've had some conversations recently, I said. that have given me a clearer picture of the landscape. And I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty serves everyone better at this stage. I paused. I'm not interested in causing harm to this family. David and I had real years together, and despite everything, I don't carry anger for its own sake. I looked at the check on the table. But I'm also not interested in signing something that benefits everyone in this room except me, in exchange for looking the other way at things that may be considerably larger than a divorce settlement. The room was very quiet. Patricia's composure, that remarkable 40-year construction, showed its first hairline fracture, not visible in her expression exactly, in her breathing, in the way her folded hands tightened almost imperceptibly. I think, I said, standing up slowly, that we all need better attorneys in this room before we have this conversation properly. I'm going to give you the name of mine. I'd suggest you call her today. I picked up the check from the table, because it was in my name, and touching it felt like the truest possible thing I could do in that moment. And I held it out toward Gerald. You'll want this back. We're not done talking yet. He took it. Patricia looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from her in 11 years. Not displeasure, not the cool assessment I knew. Something closer to recognition. The next 4 months were the most complicated of my life and simultaneously the most clarifying. Denise flew in from Nashville and we sat at my kitchen table, the same table Patricia had tried to use as her transaction desk, for 3 days working through every document, every account, every piece of the picture Terry and my compliance contact had helped me assemble. The state inquiry that my former colleague had mentioned moved forward, through its own channels, independent of anything I did or said directly. Documentation I'd provided to appropriate legal channels did its work through proper processes. I was careful, on Denise's instruction, to stay well within the lines. No leaks to journalists, no dramatic confrontations. Everything through official procedures. David, once he understood what the landscape actually looked like, stopped being directed by his parents' legal strategy and hired his own attorney. That was telling. It meant he understood that his interests and theirs were no longer perfectly aligned. Our actual divorce, stripped of Patricia's desired clean ending, was finalized in a proceeding that bore very little resemblance to the 37-page document I'd been handed over morning coffee. The marital estate, assessed properly and without the artificial compression of a rushed settlement, was divided according to Texas community property law. Straightforward. Fair. Nothing dramatic. My premarital investment portfolio, all $4.3 million of it, was confirmed as my separate property. It never entered the negotiation. There was no non-disclosure agreement. There was no hush payment. What there was, some months later, was a public record of an investigation into the business practices of Holt Development's public-private partnership project, the details of which I'll leave to the public record where they belong. David eventually sold his stake in the family company and moved to Colorado. I heard from a mutual friend that he seemed quieter there, less pressed into a shape. I understood that. I was quieter too, now that no one was pressing. Patricia called me once, about 8 months after the divorce was final. She didn't apologize, which I'd expected. Apologizing would have required admitting error, which was not in her operational vocabulary. What she said, in a voice that carried the texture of someone doing something genuinely difficult, was, "You handled yourself with more dignity than we gave you credit for." From Patricia Holt, that was the equivalent of falling to her knees. I thanked her. I meant it. Some gestures are worth accepting, even when they arrive late and underscaled. I moved back to Louisiana 9 months after the divorce. Not to Shreveport exactly, but close. A smaller town nearby, with a main street that still had an actual hardware store and a diner where the coffee came in a ceramic mug and nobody asked what. Table you'd reserved? I bought a house with a back porch that faced east. I planted a vegetable garden. The tomatoes this time worked out. I still do hospital administration consulting, but on my own terms now, taking projects that interest me, setting my own hours,